The royal hush broke at exactly 3 minutes past the hour, not in a formal manner, not in the conventional sense. However, a confirmation that was so stark and so carefully controlled sent shockwaves across Britain and abroad right once. This was not a scandal or succession announcement. It has to do with a kid, Louis the Prince. And before a single word was fully comprehended, the manner Prince William and Princess Catherine came forward jointly told the world everything. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any updates before we delve further into what this actually implies for the royal family. With the force of thunder, the message came like a whisper. Neither a pre-announcement nor a large press conference were chosen by Buckingham Palace. Instead, official royal platforms displayed a single, stark notification. Despite being brief, less than 100 words, each post had an almost intolerable sense of gravitas. It was no accident that the time was 3 minutes past the hour. Royal observers are aware that when announcements deviate from the norm, a terrible problem has occurred behind the scenes. Not only was the message's content shocking, but so was the person who conveyed it. The message was issued by the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge themselves, something the palace has never permitted in recent memory. Not with a representative, not by a formal herald. However, as parents, they are both piercing the royal barrier to address the world directly. That was seismic in and of itself. They spoke in a calm, but clearly serious tone. Panic was absent, but there's also no hope. Rather, there was a strong sense of acceptance. Words like ongoing support, deeply personal, and thankful for understanding conveyed a much worse image than they could publicly express. Every carefully constructed line was read by the public, who were already accustomed to the monarchy's coded language. Prince Louis had a serious problem, and they weren't only requesting more room, they were begging. News anchors were fumbling over their scripts in a matter of minutes. After decades of ceremonial formality, royal correspondence was noticeably unsettled. On air, a few acknowledged that they had never witnessed anything similar. Twitter went crazy. Telegram groups became active. Beyond the United Kingdom, the shockwaves spread throughout Europe, Australia, Canada, and even the United States. This was more than simply news. It was a rift in the structure of what many people thought was a flawlessly run royal family. As the world took the hit, parallels started to circulate. Commentators with years of experience recalled the silence around the announcement of Princess Diana's death, the incredulity, the sudden lack of knowledge. Others reflected on the Queen's passing when time itself seems to stop. This felt different, though. This has nothing to do with the demise of a leader or the end of an era. It has to do with a boy. In a devastating declaration, a child whose face had formerly added humor and charm to formal appearances was suddenly reduced to a name. Everyone was plagued by the finality as much as the sadness. The phrases that were used were not the ones that are usually reserved for minor health scares or short-term setbacks. They sounded definitive. They sounded unchangeable. And Britain did not simply hold its breath at that moment. It started to cry because it feared it already knew what had happened to Prince Louis, not because it really comprehended it. Palace insiders, however, knew that the true severity rested in what William and Catherine were still keeping hidden as the country concentrated on what had been spoken. Royal declarations are meant to be soothing, but this one made me uneasy. Every sentence seemed to be burdened by omissions. The pauses, the softer wording, and the glaring lack of promises were all noted by analysts. This was not an optimistic language. It was the preparatory language. In a matter of minutes, seasoned observers started posing the most terrifying query of all. What did William and Catherine not want to say aloud? Newsrooms did more than simply report on the remark. They also conducted in-depth analysis in the immediate aftermath, not only the words, but the manner in which they were spoken. More striking than the words themselves was the tone, which was somber and muted. The polished words of certainty had vanished. Timelines, promises of a return to normalcy, and consoling phrases like expected to make a full recovery or currently resting and responding well were not provided. Rather, the message was serene on the outside, but incredibly unsettling on the inside, existing in a condition of suspended emotion. The phrasing itself seems to have been the result of much agonizing thought. Insiders claimed that palace aides redrafted it for hours, pausing between each syllable to consider the meaning of each word. They were preparing the public for something irreversible, not merely writing a press release. The deliberate removal of medical jargon, names of physicians, and even the word health issue spoke a lot. It was more of a resignation to something they could no longer control than a declaration of clarity. But what was most notable was what was left unsaid. When Prince Louis might be spotted in public again was not mentioned. There was no indication that he would be attending school again, or that he would be joining his siblings at some point in the future. It was evident that this was not a delay, because there was no projection. A derailment occurred, and rumors that this crisis had been simmering for much longer than anyone knew became more prevalent behind closed doors. Reporters who had spent decades covering the monarchy started watching new footage of Prince Louis again. Previously fun smiles now appeared strained. Moments that had been written off as childish pranks were now being read as indicators of something more serious. Even William, Catherine, and Louis's body language during previous public appearances took on new significance. Only now were people beginning to notice the signals that had been there. Not just the general population was taken by surprise. Only a few hours prior to the release of the statement, several palace employees reportedly discovered the full extent of the problem. They were not acting out their astonishment or sadness. It was uncooked. It was more than just a distressed child. It concerned the dissolution of the delusion that the youngest members of the royal family, protected by regularity and security, were somehow impervious to the turmoil of genuine human conflict. The knowledge that this was not a transient situation was perhaps the most distressing of all. This was the silent start of something long-term, not a respite from royal life. Not a declaration of defeat, but a readiness for it. Behind the broken royal facade, two parents were frantically attempting to postpone the unavoidable disclosure of an agony they were unable to control. Prince William then did something unexpected, against centuries of royal instinct. He didn't speak for the institution, he talked from the heart. No podium, no script, and no formality shield were present. The next thing Prince William said was as a father, unraveling in real time, rather than as a future king. His voice trailed off, his poise faltered. And that's when the most carefully maintained fiction of the monarchy fell apart. This was sorrow. Helplessness and fear were exposed for the world to see. It was evident right away that something had changed when William entered the spotlight. There was no speech here. It was an admission. The meticulously crafted picture of the calm, collected heir had vanished, to be replaced by a man fighting to suppress feelings that had been simmering beneath the surface for a long time. He didn't start off with the customary greetings. He didn't start by expressing gratitude to the public or the media. To start, he said, "I should have spotted it sooner." An entire country came to a halt after hearing one sentence alone. William broke decades of royal estrangement in those 6 words. He spoke like someone who had failed, not as someone in a position of authority. He talked of the months of quiet anxiety in the palace, how Louis had become more reserved and quiet, and how the family had initially written it off as a passing phase. He acknowledged that the responsibilities and customs of court life had obscured the real situation at home, And instead of getting tougher to ignore, the signals got easier with every day that went by. Beneath the openness, however, was a more profound reality that exposed William's crippling guilt. He talked of spending evenings pacing the hallways and wondering how he, of all people, had been unaware. How he could be so sensitive to national issues while being oblivious to the suffering in his own country. He remembered times when Louis would request to skip family events, times when his eyes, which had once been filled with wonder, appeared hollow, and times when his laughing appeared practiced. William acknowledged, and still, he didn't want to believe, so he did nothing. But one memory broke his voice completely. William hesitated. After gathering his thoughts, he muttered the question Louis had previously posed to him. When I don't feel like smiling, do I still have to? The question was more profound than any royal crisis could ever be. It was a plea, not a revolt, a child's cry, lost in a sea of unspoken expectations. William admitted that it almost broke him when he saw his son clearly for the first time. He didn't mince words. He explained how everything had been impacted by the emotional toll, his fatherhood, and his marriage. Even the relationship that exists between Louis, Charlotte, and George. The household's equilibrium had shifted. Catherine made an effort to remain composed. George had become more somber. And Charlotte had begun observing Louis with eyes that reflected their mother's silent concern. The realization that they had actually secluded Louis in an effort to protect him was possibly the most painful. William put it simply. We erected barriers that even we were unable to see through in an attempt to protect him from the outside world. The words reverberated like thunder. The world witnessed what it meant for the first time when parental instinct and royal duty clashed, and the fact that the harm wasn't always apparent until it was almost irreparable. However, another youngster in the family was already silently breaking behind closed doors as William was speaking in public. This burden was never intended for Princess Charlotte. However, his sister filled the emotional hole left by Prince Louis's inward retreat, absorbing anxiety she didn't comprehend and shielding anguish she couldn't heal. When Catherine's power finally gave out, she came to a terrible realization. One child was not the only victim of the tragedy. Silently, it was spreading throughout the household. Charlotte held firm during the early stages of Louis's breakdown. In public, she was the one who held his hand. When the cameras stopped filming, the person whispered to him, the person who stood a little too close to her. Many assumed it was simply a close sibling relationship. However, it went beyond that. Even though she was young, Charlotte had already started to bear the unsaid pain of her brother. She became his shadow, his translator, and, unbeknownst to others, his protection. The symptoms of Charlotte's internal breakdown didn't appear until weeks later, long after William's public admission. Catherine described a silent Sunday afternoon at home when Charlotte abruptly stopped talking, a moment that crushed her heart. Not out of disobedience or rage, but rather because of fatigue, emotional tiredness. When Catherine asked her what was wrong, she curled into herself, her eyes wide and far away. Her response was a whisper that no parent can forget. I wanted you to stop worrying. No headline could pierce as deeply as that statement. It validated Catherine's suspicion that the crisis was no longer the only thing affecting the kids. They were handling it. Additionally, they had become victims of their parents' suffering while attempting to shield them from it. The roles had switched. The grown-ups were being protected by the children. By this time, Louis had virtually abandoned his routine. He stopped inquiring about his school pals. He stopped pleading with me to stay up late. The jokes that only kids find hilarious no longer made him chuckle. Slowly, cruelly, the spark was dying. Catherine witnessed Charlotte's daily efforts to reignite that flame through games, music, and quiet companionship. However, it was failing, and she was slipping slowly too. No one had really understood the damage that quiet was causing to the family inside the palace, where duty frequently triumphs over emotion. There were no boisterous altercations. There isn't any obvious disorder, just a gradual smothering of emotions. The loudest cry they had heard was Charlotte's breakdown, which came from silence rather than a tantrum or sobs. Catherine came to that realization. Not only had they missed Louis's suffering, but they had also missed the sound of it reverberating throughout their house. The delusion that the situation could be handled was destroyed by the realization that a single child could contain it. Like a silent wave, it had swept across society, tearing at the ties that bound parents, siblings, and even the foundation of regal habit. All along, silence had been their adversary, and now it was unsustainable. The moment that proved the crisis had reached its breaking point then arrived. Prince Louis completely disappeared from everyday life. It was supposed to be just another morning, but Prince Louis never showed up. No explanations, no school, no appearances. A decision had been taken behind the scenes that would change his upbringing forever. The reasons behind the monarchy's covert removal of its youngest member from public life were far more grave than anyone could have imagined. There was a deafening silence surrounding his absence. The sudden departure was felt, not just observed, for a toddler whose cheeky smiles and sporadic waving had enthralled millions. Hushed conversations were sent to his school's parents. His classmates were informed that he would be studying at home. Additionally, the media respected the blackout, albeit suspiciously. Something had changed, and it had rocked the House of Wales to its foundation, whatever it was. Later, insiders would talk of a particular instance, a school-related occurrence that was said to be the last straw. Although specifics are still under wraps, insiders allude to a confrontation that emotionally overtook Louis. It wasn't physical. I couldn't re-engage. Discipline wasn't applied. It was sentimental. Inside him, something broke, and Catherine knew in that moment. Her son was no longer safe in the outer world, not in a mental, emotional, or spiritual sense. The family withdrew in a matter of hours. A series of urgent meetings ensued. Once so committed to the idea of normalcy, William and Catherine now had to face the fact that tradition could no longer shield their kid. The urge to be noticed, to smile, to wave, to act like a well-mannered royal child had turned into poison, and it had to end. No royal had ever made such a choice in recent memory. To completely remove a young prince from the public eye without relocation, illness, or scandal. No overseas tour. Balmoral won't have a summer. No flimsy justification. Just not there. William and Catherine decided against making a formal announcement. No public farewell was planned. There were no contrived photos to commemorate his brief absence. As a form of protection, they chose to remain silent, something that the royal family hardly ever does. However, the decision's emotional impact was devastating behind the scenes. Louis didn't resist it, he didn't object, but he also didn't inquire as to why. Catherine was broken by that. Quiet, almost robotic, was his resignation. The once bright child has grown into a cautious, protective, and somewhat aloof adult. Long-term effects were cautioned by experts discreetly called in to evaluate the emotional toll, particularly if the royal expectations persisted in the background, even after being out of the public eye. The concern that every attempt they made to raise their children in a normal, balanced atmosphere had failed was what troubled William and Catherine the most, not the fact that they had missed the warning signs sooner, because public duty, tradition, and ritual continued to be the foundation of even their idea of normal. They now had to question if Louis's identity was the one tearing him apart from the moment of his birth. An unexpected personality emerged as the family withdrew inside. One who was more aware than others of the price of royal pressure stepped forward. Princess Anne took action, while advisors hesitated and systems stalled. Just instinct, no permission, no press. She refused to allow history to repeat itself because she understood the pattern, the pressure, the damage, and the quiet. She provided Prince Louis something significantly more radical within the monarchy rather than treatment shrouded in etiquette: normalcy. The palace had been paralyzed. Optics were discussed by bureaucrats. Advisors avoided talking about language. Precedent was a concern for strategists. However, none of them were posing the crucial question: what would be beneficial to the child? Princess Anne, the family's ever-pragmatic anchor, picked up the phone and insisted on speaking with William, while others rushed to contain the damage. Not as a counselor or a royal, but as a sister who had witnessed too much of the emotional toll of the monarchy and harbored too many regrets. The conversation that ensued shattered protocol. Anne issued instructions without requesting permission. William was informed by her that the boy needed to leave from the palaces, outside of the usual, from the oppressive expectations that were destroying his soul. Roundtable discussions and media announcements weren't the answer. The crown never ventured to accept it. Simplicity. Louis was therefore subtly moved while being watched over by Anne, not to a medical facility, not to a therapist's office, but to a place where duties were real and royal titles had no meaning. Days started out with structure, not for show, but for a reason. Simple tasks like walking outside and feeding animals serve as grounding rather than punishment. Anne took away everything that was required of him by society and replaced it with something that the royal family had long since forgotten: freedom devoid of spectacle. She was an experienced practitioner. She had experienced it firsthand. Buried under tradition, she had witnessed Diana's cry for assistance. She had witnessed William internalize, Harry rebel, and a whole family disintegrate because to appearances. And she had long since made the decision to step in. If she ever witnessed it occurring again, she fulfilled that commitment with Louis. Something moved slowly. He started talking more, eating more easily. His eyes, which had been far away and heavy, started to concentrate once again. There was no miraculous comeback. There isn't a breakthrough moment to record. However, there were brief glimmers, vital indicators of a reawakening inside him. He smiled, not for the cameras but for himself, and resumed his questioning. Anne concealed everything from the general population. No pictures, no leaks. Even if some royal insiders became uneasy about her overstepping her authority, she insisted on solitude. However, she had always valued responsibilities over roles. And in this instance, she had an obligation to safeguard the boy, not the reputation. Nevertheless, rumors started to circulate within the palace gates as Louis started to rebuild himself away from the establishment that had once shattered him. Anne's subtle resistance did not sit well with everyone, because she had exposed the system in the process of defending the child. Furthermore, systems are not amenable to exposure. Darker elements within the palace were already working against the family as Louis started to recover. As optimism blossomed, a secret document exploded within the monarchy. Its words were icy, calculated, and frightening. The memo discussed risk management, containment, and optics rather than healing. And William realized something terrible when he read it. Some people at the institution no longer saw his kid as a youngster to be protected, but rather as a problem to be managed. They were never supposed to receive the memo. It had been marked with maximum confidentially, written behind closed doors, and shared among senior aides. However, secrets don't remain hidden for very long, as is frequently the case inside the palace walls. It was more than just a betrayal of confidence when the document eventually reached William. Wrapped in administrative formality, it was a betrayal. The tone was impersonal and clinical. Prince Louis's name came up under terms like containment strategy, visibility, and reputational instability rather than care or worry. It reads more like a corporate damage report than the tragic story of a family. His emotional condition was not mentioned. There were bullet points on avoiding public inquiries, refocusing attention on more compelling stories, and even hints that permanent invisibility could be the most stable course of action, all without taking into account what the youngster had gone through. It was not a healing strategy. It served as an erase blueprint. William's response was instantaneous and explosive. Even his closest aides were taken aback by the ensuing rage, which was surprising for a guy who had been taught to maintain order and discipline. With the memo in hand, he allegedly stormed out of the room and demanded to know who had given the go-ahead. Employees reported hearing William yelling, saying that this family had previously concealed too many realities behind silence and that his kid was not a headline to handle. Catherine's answer was equally loud, but her anger was more precise than William's, which shook walls. She entered top advisors' offices directly and set the printed memo down on the table. Nothing to say. Just a look that didn't allow for any defense. Then she asked firmly and calmly, "If it were your child, would you talk like this?" There was no response. After learning of the memo, Princess Anne was unwilling to overlook it. The emotional center had been held constant only by her. She could now plainly see what she had always suspected. Legacy was still prioritized over life in some parts of the organization. Anne wasn't merely furious. In what many referred to as the most unadulterated display of familial solidarity the contemporary monarchy had ever witnessed, she openly supported William and Catherine, made calls, and demanded accountability. However, the harm had already been done. When the memo was leaked to the media, there was an immediate outcry as excerpts were released. The insensitivity of the palace was denounced in headlines. Scathing statements were released by mental health organizations. Anger, incredulity, and support for the Wales family erupted on social media. For the first time in decades, the royal institution was forced to defend itself against its own heartless machinery rather than scandal. The public recognized this for what it was, an institution attempting to quiet a youngster for the sake of tradition. It was more than simply a PR disaster, it was a moral failure. The ensuing tidal surge of rage was something they had not expected, because the nation was unwilling to turn a blind eye now that the veil had been lifted. The palace was forced to do what it had avoided for generations when confidence was broken and anger grew. At last, the illusion was broken. The palace acknowledged the unimaginable in a statement that was unprecedented. Support for Prince Louis's emotional recuperation was continuous. Just the truth, without any euphemisms or deception. Centuries of royal invulnerability fell apart in a single sentence, and the public's reaction was tremendous. There were no trumpets or broadcast formalities associated with the announcement. Silently, it was released, almost with humility, but it had a seismic effect. For the first time in contemporary history, Buckingham Palace, which has long been a bastion of stoicism, decided to accept a royal child's fragility without any preconceptions or bias. The language was straightforward. Prince Louis was recuperating. He was still getting emotional support. Additionally, the family was requesting understanding rather than privacy. It was a human remark rather than a hierarchical one. The public was taken aback not only by the message but also by Catherine, who influenced it. There was no mistaking her fingerprints. A second note sent by the Princess of Wales herself arrived within hours. Very personal, handwritten. She spoke in the voice of a mother rather than a princess. "Some truths are too delicate to share until they're ready to be held," she said, acknowledging the difficulty of silence and thanking the country for its patience. Suddenly, something changed. Camera phones were no longer being held up by the crowd outside the gates. Their breath was held. The impact was instantaneous and worldwide. Not only did messages flood in from Britain, but they came from all across the world. Hashtags trended for parents, educators, medical professionals, and others who had walked the same tightrope between healing and isolation, fear and silence. Mental health organizations commended the bravery of the family. Support for kid emotional awareness campaigns increased dramatically. All of a sudden, Louis was more than just a prince. He was a representation. A reminder that emotional suffering affects everyone, even those who are born into unthinkable privilege. And with that, a long-buried aspect of the monarchy started to come to light. The media was inundated with comparisons of Diana's legacy, not for scandal, but for sympathy. Diana had discussed eating issues, postpartum depression, and emotional maltreatment in the royal residence decades prior. Back then, she had received criticism and even punishment. Her candor, however, was now being reframed as foresight rather than weakness. In many respects, Louis' story continued where hers had ended. And it wasn't silenced by the institution this time. It gave itself up to it. In front of the public, rather than through speeches or ceremonies, the concept of royal strength started to shift. Actually, though, it was the painful type, the healing sort. The ability to communicate, "We're not okay," was now used to measure strength instead of poise. Additionally, we're taking action. The monarchy appeared more like a family than a castle for the first time in decades. Flawed, broken, making an effort. However, the news didn't actually make a big difference. It was much more subdued. Ultimately, it was neither a speech nor a declaration. It was a picture. With his hands in the dirt, Prince Louis is planting something new next to his mother. No distance, no crowns, just getting better. More people saw that picture than any headline, putting an end to critics and changing the tragic story to one of bravery. There was no official palace caption or announcement to go with it. It was discreetly reposted by royal channels after initially appearing to have been released by a charity closely associated with Catherine's mental health work. However, an explanation was not necessary. The universe instantly grasped. This was not a publicity stunt. It was a statement of silent power. There was no parade back into the spotlight for a child who had disappeared from the public glare. People were seeing him for who he really was: human, expanding, healing. The palace had never witnessed a response like this. On air, news anchors broke down in tears. Instead of being reactive, social media became thoughtful. The boy was now the center of attention rather than the royal titles. A youngster who had been the focus of conjecture and anxiety for months was now rooted in reality. Soil, a little trowel, and a mother's hand softly leading her sons were all that was present. No elaborate outfits, no great palatial settings. And in that instant, a significant event occurred. The public's attitude started to change. What began as concern turned into a shared sense of empathy. Louis was now a mirror rather than a puzzle to be solved. The indicators of silence, every family learning too late and reaching LAs, and every youngster struggling under the weight of expectations are all reflected in this. Although his suffering was still present, his power was at last being recognized. Despite never having spoken in public, Louis had come to represent strength rather than weakness, of what it means to fail, but still decide to try again. The photograph was hailed as a turning moment by mental health organizations. Discussions were held in schools. Parents told each other stories. Families all around Britain and beyond saw reality in that picture instead of monarchy. Furthermore, the image compelled an internal reckoning within the organization. Vulnerability had been viewed as a liability for far too long. It was now being recast as a brave deed. Louis is the embodiment of a lesson that Diana taught Catherine. The crown wasn't glowing under the burden of perfection for once. The reality eased it. And even though it was quiet, that change was obvious. It was the start of something new, a monarchy that does not hesitate to use human language, a royal family open to public education. Finally, a system that shifts from secrecy to compassion. Once whispered with fear, Louis' story had evolved into something very different, a reason to think that change was achievable. One reality also remains as the world observes this family's progress. Not only was Prince Louis' story heartbreaking, but it also marked a turning point in the monarchy's approach to dealing with suffering, love, and compassion. I appreciate you watching. Remember to subscribe and like. We'll see you at the following one.